Hello, I'm Paul Taillon, and this is the Strategic Thinker series. Today I have the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Charles Burton, author of the new book, The Beaver and the Dragon, How China Outmaneuvered Canada's Diplomacy, Security, and Sovereignty. Your book is a compendium of articles arranged in segments: the Stephen Harper era, the Justin Trudeau era, hostage diplomacy, Huawei and Canada's security, coronavirus, and Canada's sovereignty versus China and Trump. I'm curious, how did you decide upon this arrangement, and what did you see as a common thread across these segments?
Well, I've done about 200, more than 200 of these opinion pieces in the Canadian national press and some abroad over the past 10 or so years. And this book, in addition to the sections on my background, my period of incarceration by the Chinese Ministry of State Security, and my hopes for how Canada should proceed in the future, selects, in addition, 60 or so of my short pieces that are seen to be ones that provide us with some kind of insight into how Canada has enabled the expansion of Chinese influence in Canada, and has not been successful in expanding our market share in China in the past. And certainly they have been divided up by topics, and the COVID fiasco, the Winnipeg Labs fiasco, and so on are a distinct subcategory of how China functions in terms of its espionage approach. And then the relations between Canada, China, and the US is also relevant to the current situation. I'm not sure that you can see a great difference between the approach to China under Prime Minister Harper and then under Prime Minister Trudeau. Although Harper, I think, had people in the cabinet that were more concerned about China's expanding risk to our security and sovereignty than perhaps in the Trudeau Liberal cabinet. And then we saw the Liberals having an over-exaggerated sense of the significance of Canada to China, typified by the Prime Minister in 2017 attempting to negotiate a free trade agreement with China that would include riders on gender rights, labor rights, and environmental rights, which China has with no other trade agreement and would be extremely unlikely to adopt, although Mr. Trudeau at the time suggested it was because it would be China's first free trade agreement with a G7 country. Now we're in a situation where Mr. Harper is long gone. Mr. Trudeau's policies seem to be the subject of reevaluation, and Mr. Carney is looking to revive the 2005 strategic partnership between Canada and China, and has been using Chinese language like pragmatic and constructive, recalibrate to try and return to something like the Chrétien era policies, where we agree with the Chinese urging that we set aside differences and seek common ground. And the Chinese suggest that we will be able to diversify our trade into China and build Canadian prosperity against the Trump challenge, which could lead to unemployment, reshoring of factories, and general economic turndown, in exchange for not interfering in China's operations in Canada and abroad, which would include our very strong concerns over China's influence over our democratic institutions, the co-opting of Canadian elites to serve Chinese purposes, the extensive espionage program to gather Canadian dual-use technologies that could be applied to China's military, particularly if there's a war coming up between China and the West over Taiwan or the South China Sea, and China's incursions into the Arctic as well as China's concerns over our current limiting their access to mining in the critical mineral sector and to access to Canadian labs engaged in sensitive research. We have the experience of the Winnipeg labs fiasco that seems to have a strong connection to the disastrous spread of COVID around the world. So, there are a lot of lessons there that we should look at in terms of things we've done wrong in the past and assumptions that we've made, and are giving China a free ride in terms of shaping our own policy. So, you read the book, it should give us a manual on how to do China better. And I hope that people in Ottawa will take this book seriously and try and make up for the really lack of expertise and advice that the Prime Minister is evidently currently receiving, and the general lack of China-based expertise within the government that's causing us to make the same errors over and over again and follow other countries in the same path, which is serving China's interests big time. And I mean, finally, aside from the free trade possibility, we have heard from the Asia Pacific Foundation that China might ask Canada to join the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a global economic restructuring program where all the belts and roads lead to China, so that Canada would be put into a subordinate position, sort of like Argentina, if you will, in terms of our global relations. In the short term, this would lead to expanded trade with China and Chinese funding for much needed Canadian infrastructure. But in the long term, I think it would serve Canada very badly to become beholden to China as an emerging great power. So, there's a lot in the book that I think is important, and I hope that people will read it and benefit from what I've said in the past to shape the way we move in the future.
While Canadians have been focused on the Trump impact regarding our Canada-US tariff war, you note a considerable impact on Canada regarding Trump and his actions towards China. Has this impacted or influenced the declaration last month of a rapprochement with China by Prime Minister Carney?
I think, certainly Mr. Carney's interaction with China seems to be one where we will completely abide by Chinese terms, as I said, seeking common ground while setting aside differences. Historically, this policy has not proven successful. And under Prime Minister Chrétien, we had a similar sort of policy of going easy on human rights and sending out these enormous Team Canada missions with a view to expanding our exports into China and building Canadian prosperity and diversifying from our overdependence on the US economy. But if you look at the actual numbers in the Chrétien period, our share of the Chinese market actually declined. And so any assumption that Mr. Carney may have that if we make concessions to China in non-trade areas, that we, don't criticize China's genocidal policies towards the Uyghur minority or China's illegal expansion of its territory into islands in the South China Sea, or in general, China's support for third world dictatorships, counter democracy third world dictatorships, by providing them with generous funding and surveillance technology, that Canada will benefit, and that we should focus on building Canadian prosperity through trade. But historically, China has never opened its market to Canada in any significant way, regardless of what we do. We're just not that important to them, and I think that point has to be emphasized in our dealings with China. In terms of the United States, certainly the U.S. is very concerned about Canada possibly removing the 100% tariff on electric vehicles. We imposed that tariff because the electric vehicles are heavily subsidized by the Chinese state, and therefore our own electric vehicles would cease to be competitive if we let them in untariffed. And secondly, because of their ability to gather enormous amounts of data
Data.
comparable to Huawei 5G, say, or Nuctec, which we earlier banned, which would pose a geostrategic threat to Canada in the medium and longer term. So there does seem to be talk that if Canada allowed Chinese EVs to be sold in Canada, that the United States, say, may not allow those EVs to be driven into the U.S. In other words, you want to drive to your condo in Florida, your car would be stopped at the border. And there's certainly a lot of other areas where the U.S. could cause Canada great pain economically and in other ways if we start to act at cross purposes the U.S.'s China policy. So I don't know the extent to which Mr. Carney has been communicating with the Trump administration about China, but it's clear that we should be ensuring that we're not going to very much regret any kind of attempt to engage in free trade with China or the Belt and Road or further integration or not standing up to disallow the Chinese from receiving Five Eyes related military technologies, which could be used against the United States and its allies in future. So it is a very tricky game, and I think up to now the Trump administration probably hasn't really noticed what's going on between Canada and China, but eventually they'll get to that, and we'll have to bear any consequences of any ill-advised interaction with the Chinese regime. That being said, Mr. Carney's under a lot of pressure from Canadian business to encourage greater sales into China, and there's also the issue of China's heavy tariffs on Canadian canola seeds, which has a devastating impact on 40,000 prairie farmers and associated businesses. Previously, we produced about $12 billion of value out of canola, and 4 or 5 billion was typically sold into the Chinese market alone. So there are a lot of pressures there to make concessions to China to serve our economic interests, but those concessions may come back to haunt us badly, as my book illustrates in several of the sections of trying to stop the Canadian government from doing the bad thing, and then trying to pick up the pieces after our government has made decisions that turned out to go against the Canadian national interest economically and security and protection of our sovereignty.
Charles, how would you sum up former U.S. President Joe Biden's relationship with the Chinese leadership, and what can we in Canada learn from it?
Well, I think the Biden administration's relations with China were largely incoherent. Biden continued the Trump era policies of tariffs, became more serious about China's infiltration into military technological development, and then there's also the concerns over China's obtaining chip-based technologies that could be used in AI and high-tech weaponry that could come to threaten the United States. And Mr. Biden was sort of ambiguous on the United States' commitment to the defense of democratic Taiwan. So I think it was a period of weak leadership that has allowed China to continue to make the geostrategic gains, particularly in the third world, but also in the Asia-Pacific region, that are gradually leading to China potentially gaining the upper hand in global affairs, and China, on the assumption that the U.S. is a declining power, rising up to fill the power vacuum of U.S. withdrawal from global leadership and developing this community of the common destiny of mankind, which is China-based autocratic values, strongman interaction in global affairs, which would reduce the institutions that Canada as a middle power relies on so much, like the United Nations, like NATO, like the WTO, to a lesser influence as China and the other great power, Russia, make decisions that impact on all of us to their own benefit and the realization of their own ideologies and interpretations of history. So, we would see a situation where China has made clear that they cannot allow Russia to fail in Ukraine. And if Russia achieves its goals in Ukraine, would then move on to other nations. And I think China has similar ambitions towards of Taiwan, of course, but also Korea, the reunification of the Korean Peninsula under a China-oriented regime, and in general developing a sphere of influence that removes the influence of the United States in the Indo-Pacific and in general allows China to become a much stronger power that has hegemonic capacity, becoming really the new superpower of the globe. And Mr. Xi's stated ambition is to achieve that by 2050. Whether he will or not remains to be seen, and I think a lot of that would be dependent on what sort of international role the United States sees for itself in the remaining years of the Trump administration and ahead.
You've raised concerns about China's influence on and over Canadian politicians and the penetration into Canada's government. Has the threat level changed since you first wrote about it, and how can the Canadian government address this perceived threat?
Well, I've been sounding the alarm on this for quite some time. And of course, we saw movement in Australia with legislation and a foreign registry, which I think was quite effective in constraining persons of influence in the policy process from receiving benefits or deferred benefits from a foreign state. So, I think there is a kind of understanding that if a person, a politician or senior civil servant, while in a position of public trust, does not enact policies which constrain China's large geostrategic purpose in Canada, that there will be rewards in terms of law firm opportunities or board memberships or business. And we see an awful lot of this in Canada, maybe more than anywhere else in the world. So I think that we saw the release of documents by Canadian intelligence sources. I don't know if it was CSIS or the Intelligence Assessment part of the Privy Council office. But in any event, those were released. They showed that the Canadian government had not been responsive to concerns by our agents on the ground with regard to Chinese subversion activities and interference in democratic processes, and it shows that the government did not respond appropriately to these concerns. They more or less threw them in the back of a drawer. So, we had David Johnston doing an investigation that was deemed unsatisfactory, and then we had the Ogg Commission on Foreign Influence that met over, I think, 16 months to investigate this issue and heard a lot of evidence that, in fact, there is a lot of Chinese interference and subversion activities going on in Canada. And then Canada enacted Bill C-70 against foreign influence, which calls for the appointment of a foreign influence commissioner and the development of a foreign influence registry. That bill went through unanimously the House of Commons in June 2024. We're now up to the end of 2026, and even though it's the law of the land, the government has still not made the Order in Council appointment of the Foreign Influence Commissioner, and we have not got a foreign influence registry so that people who have a conflict of interest because they've received benefits from a foreign state would publicly declare it, so that we'd understand this reality in terms of their own policy and advising. Neither of those things has come to pass, and the government keeps deferring. We're now probably looking at the latest is the spring. It was initially that they promised to get it done by before Parliament in September. That didn't work. Then they talked about before the end of this year. Now they're talking about next spring. The fact is that there are significant elements within our government that do not want a foreign registry, and presumably that's because it would require some Canadians who would prefer that not be known that they receive benefits from a foreign state, particularly China, to have to publicly declare that and I guess suffer loss of income and some questioning of their of things that they've done in the past. So it's a disturbing situation. We thought that we'd had big success with the Yaw Commission and with Bill C-70, but the recommendation of the Yaw Commission have not really been followed. Quite common with these commissions, royal or otherwise, that they tend to fade away from the government agenda. But more seriously, we did enact legislation. It is the law of the land, and we are not seeing the Foreign Influence Commissioner or a Foreign Influence Registry. So, I certainly pushed hard for this. I didn't expect that we would see this kind of tactic where it's on the books, but the government won't implement it.
You note in your book the necessity of Canada, quote, developing a backbone, unquote, when dealing with China. For China, this is a long game. How are we faring?
Well, badly. I think, essentially, China, like all dictators, respect strength and integrity. And our current prime minister, in his echoing the Chinese language, I mean, when he met with the Chinese General Secretary of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, in his lesser capacity as president of China, Mr. Xi talked about us having pragmatic and constructive relations. And then in his response, Mr. Carney repeated that phrase twice, using the Chinese language, and also talked about developing a resilient and better international system, which suggested, be good to follow this up with Mr. Carney, that in fact Canada is prepared to work with China towards this community of the common destiny of mankind. I just despair about this because the Chinese perceive us as weak and will continue to seek concessions. I mean, if we get the tariffs off the canola, what prevents the Chinese from putting tariffs on our potash or our pulp and paper on spurious grounds, such as we subsidize it, or our product is not meeting international phytosanitary standards or something like that. So I think the only way for us to maintain our integrity is to be absolutely frank with the Chinese about our concerns over their domestic and international behavior, which violates the treaties that we all uphold, like the Treaty on the Law of the Sea and treaties against genocide and torture, and tell them that we won't tolerate their espionage in our country any further, and that we will be expelling the large cohort of diplomats who are involved in harassment and espionage activities, or any activities that are not consistent with their legitimate diplomatic function. And we estimate that about 70% of the Chinese diplomats in Canada are not involved in diplomatic activities that are appropriate to their role. So I think that we have to we have to take a stance, and ultimately this will be better for us in terms of our relations with China than the current relations where we're seen as weak and supplicant to China's greater power. Certainly the tone of Mr. Xi's interaction with Mr. Trudeau when he dressed him down publicly, and in this latest interaction with Mr. Carney, suggests that the Chinese see us as a nation that needs China more than they need us, and that we should be obeisant to their demands and allow them to continue to expand their influence into Canada, probably starting from the north. It's not a good look for us, and ultimately, I mean, our total percentage of external commodities trade to China's only 4%. So I think a lot of Canadians think that we're highly dependent on the Chinese market. We're not, because China just doesn't take that much of what we produce.
You argue in your book that the US President Trump is assisting Xi Jinping in facilitating Xi's grand vision to become the world's unrivaled and dominant superpower by 2050. What would be the purpose of this, given Trump's own competing vision of making America great again?
Well, I think the focus of Mr. Trump is on America and the Western Hemisphere. And I'm not sure that he has the same vision as Mr. Xi. Mr. Xi wants to be the dominant power over the entire planet, and the Belt and Road Initiative, is in Africa, it's in South America, it's in parts of Southern Europe. They'd like to expand really to every corner of the globe, whereas Mr. Trump seems interested in the United States. And I mean, some indications of this are the withdrawal of funding for, say, Radio Free Asia and Radio Free Europe, the withdrawal of developmental aid, the withdrawal of support for international NGOs. The International Republican Institute has been dissolved, and a lot of the major NGOs that are involved in assisting with governance and democracy are losing their U.S. funding, and there's also the likelihood of U.S. withdrawal of funding from the United Nations, the threat of the U.S. to no longer support NATO to the extent that it has, and uncertainty over what the U.S. policy will be towards China's expansion into the South China Sea and the possible annexing of Taiwan by the mainland. So it looks as if the United States is potentially moving into an isolationist mode, and China couldn't be more delighted about that. And you take, for example, the COP30 meeting going on in Brazil right now. The U.S. is not present, but China has now assumed a leadership role. I don't think that's necessarily indicative of China's strong commitment to climate change. It doesn't have that commitment, but it does suggest that when the U.S. is absent, other countries look to China for leadership. And I think in terms of the uncertainty that countries are facing, particularly in Southeast Asia, about whether the U.S. would in fact maintain treaty obligations, it's strengthening the Chinese hand and tipping the balance in those countries towards a reorientation towards China, because they just don't know what Mr. Trump's going to do next. It's the lack of faith in the consistency of his policies or in any the integrity of any international agreement that he maintains. You can agree on something on Monday, and he's changed his mind by Friday. It's very difficult to deal with a nation that you can't rely upon to maintain its word and obligations.
As you know, in April 2025, then candidate Mark Carney named China as the most significant threat to Canada and went on to say that, quote, China is a foreign interference, geopolitical threat for Canada, unquote. Then on October 31st, 2025, Prime Minister Carney met with President of China, Xi Jinping, and they both announced that Canada and China were setting out on a new relationship. Should you write another chapter on China, what would you like to write about the Mark Carney era?
Well, I think that, certainly in our Indo-Pacific policy of a couple of years ago, we defined China as an increasingly destructive force. And I wanted the language to say strategic competitor. We didn't get that. Now, Mr. Carney and Foreign Minister Anand have said that China is a strategic partner for Canada, reviving a 2005 agreement that we had with China under Hu Jintao when he came to Canada in that year. So I'm concerned about strategic partnership. I think it's language that China uses to try and subordinate nations into supporting China's overall geostrategic plan. And I don't see us benefiting from this kind of interaction with China. What I'd like to see from Mr. Carney is perhaps a conversion on the road to Damascus, complete reversal of this policy. Perhaps once he realizes through some incident that he cannot rely on China to fulfill what it says, and that we are not going to get the kind of access to the Chinese market to diversify our trade and build prosperity that he's hoping for. Up to now, he went there. We're still seeing these heavy tariffs on the canola. China's still insisting we remove all the tariffs on the EVs. And there is some suggestion that perhaps we could get China to manufacture EVs in Canada to allay people's concerns about them, considering China's past practice, its overproduction of EVs in China, and its need to provide more employment for Chinese young people who are currently suffering close to 20% unemployment in the 18 to 24 range. It's very unlikely that China is going to be building auto factories in Canada. So I think he's badly advised on China, and I think he needs better advice. And I hope that he will come to realize this, that his previous interactions with China have been on behalf of large business, but that there's a lot more to the Canada-China relationship than trade. That there are just so many other issues that threaten the fundamentals of Canada as a nation and our role in the world that China threatens. And I think we have to be taking much more effective action to counter that. And I'm hoping that Mr. Carney will come through for us. Not seeing it yet, but as you know from my book, I always try to keep positive about the future.
What we said with the military, hope springs eternal. Okay, we're on to question 9. Canada is in a trade war with two superpowers, China and the United States. What strategy should Canada be implementing now and into the future?
Well, I think, certainly I would like to see us being much more conscious of what we can provide to the world. I think it was a grave mistake on the part of Mr. Trudeau not to respond positively to the Germans with regard to Canada supplying liquefied natural gas, yes, suggesting that they'd have to wait till we develop some hydrogen technology in the future that, is not showing any sign of happening. And I think in other aspects, we have made some mistakes. The Koreans would like more access. I think there will be an announcement about Canada's support for the critical minerals sector. And I think a lot of our allies would like to see Canada bringing the critical minerals out of the ground, getting over the environmental and indigenous rights issues and getting that stuff ready to go. And then, as Mr. Champagne has suggested, developing the facilities to process that stuff in Canada. Right now, critical minerals are 90% coming out of China because China has the technology to convert those things into what's needed to build the high-tech products that we're also dependent on. So I think that that's an area that we can offer. Certainly in terms of natural resources, we have a lot to offer. Agricultural commodities, it may be that if China refuses to take our canola, that we'd have to cycle into wheat and barley and those other kinds of things. But I think that really Canada needs to be taking a serious look at where our comparative advantages lie in a new global economy where we cannot rely on the United States or China at this time to diversify into other markets. And India is there.
Yeah.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership is not as active as it could be. We could be doing more collaboration with Europe and Australia. And I think to counter coercive measures, we ought to be working more closely with our like-minded allies so that the United States and China don't play one off the other. So, Canada is not able to sell canola seeds into China. China's been sourcing canola out of Australia. I'd really like our Australian friends to tell the Chinese that if you're not taking the Canadian canola, you're not going to get ours either. But that being said, we can seek other markets. Our agricultural commodities, the the rocks and the logs that we produce are at a global price and have a global market. So if China starts to take more soybeans from Brazil and fewer from Canada, then that opens up market space in other places. But we have to make the transition, and I think we need more support and more conscious awareness of the direction we're going to ensure that Canada can build an independent and prosperous economy. And of course, we need to be doing much more in terms of developing the North, and both militarily and in terms of transportation infrastructure, getting minerals out of the ground that the world desperately needs. And in general, trying to make the most of a bad situation by a very conscious, nonpartisan approach to how we can maximize Canadian production and maintain our economy and reduce coming unemployment and the sunsetting of certain businesses that will no longer be viable. So, there is a role there for strong activist government to play, but they've got to clear out the political crap, get rid of the internal barriers within our country, not listen as much to lobbyists and listen more to people who have a larger picture of how we can make the most for Canadians and take the strong measures necessary.
Yeah.
Whether this is possible under the current government remains to be seen. There certainly was a lot of promise early on, but then looking at the latest budget, I'm not seeing what I'd hoped for in terms of transformational or generational, as they put it. Seems to be a lot of the same stuff as before,
Yeah.
based on vested interests that are not the interests of Canada as a whole.
Charles, with everything you've studied and known as a sinologist with deep knowledge of everything in vis-a-vis China, how concerned should we as Canada and the West be with the threat of China's geopolitical initiatives?
Oh, I think we should be very much aware about China's ambitions for us, doing what we can to protect us. I mean, certainly China has strong ambitions in the Arctic, referring to China as a near Arctic state and being very interested in getting closer to the Canadian tidewaters and refusing to acknowledge our sovereignty over a lot of the Arctic waters. And certainly China's infiltration of our political system is completely unacceptable. The government's willingness to allow the Chinese state, or at least the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party, an institution which has more resources and personnel than the entire Chinese Foreign Ministry, to be so active in our country is just wrong. And as we know from the leaks to the Globe and Mail and Global News, the security agencies at the base level, the RCMP and CSIS, are very much aware of China's expanding reach into our country, have been sending out reports to the government to highlight this and expecting the government to engage in policies to counter it, and coming up with a big nothing. And I think that has to stop. Eventually, China will gain the upper hand. It's happening slowly, but it's like a game of Go. They're putting down their little coin tokens, and eventually they'll surround us, and then we won't be able to get out of the situation. And I think we need a lot more people to be trained in the Chinese language and knowledge of the communist system, and that hasn't been a priority for the government as well. I mean, imagine if we sent an ambassador to Washington that didn't know English. How would that go? But we send personnel to deal with China who don't know Chinese, and are subject to foreigner managers in the foreign ministry. And that really prevents us from understanding how we can best realize Canadian interests in our interaction with that country. But, the political will is just not there. The awareness of Canadians is just not there. I've written, as I said, 200 op-eds a lot of them repeating the same message over and over again. They seem to get a good run in the newspapers. They keep taking my stuff, but it doesn't seem to transmit into government policy to protect Canada from the threat of a hostile regime whose values are very much at odds to our own.
Great. I love that. Dr. Burton, I want to thank you for your valuable insights into Canada-China relations. And we look forward to having you back here for further discussions, and all the best in your new publication, which I was delighted to have the opportunity to read this past weekend.
Well, I hope lots of people will want to buy it. It's only $22, and I think it's well worth the money.
Well, it certainly was for me. Thank you very much. All the best, Charles.
Thank you.